G'day guys.
Hey,
My name's
how's
Russ Weakley,
it doing?
and I'm going to be talking about accessible web components. So I've got the slides available here, and you can look at them in SlideShare, Max Design, and then the title is Building Accessible Web Components. So feel free to grab them now, and you can play along as we go. So some of you are probably asking, who the hell is this guy? And that's a very good question. I'm going to tell you very briefly about my role just because it plays into some of the stuff I'll be talking about. So the main roles I have is I work in accessibility, in UX, and to some degree in front end. But my two main passions are designing and developing UI pattern libraries for application and working with developers to build accessible applications. And so I work in a lot of things like major banking corporations and things like that. And this talk, well, this talk's basically about making some of these components more accessible. So the first one I want to talk about, and this has been a pattern throughout a lot of the presentations, so if you've heard it all before, feel free to have a snooze, but this is about Aria Misuse. So the last few years, a lot of us have been noticing that the Aria attributes are growing and people are using them all the time in applications. But unfortunately, a lot of these Aria attributes can be misused, and they lead to all sorts of problems for assistive technologies. And I'll talk a few of these problems through now. And the first one is this idea of redundancy. And this is not a major problem, but it is something to be aware of. And this is where Aria attributes are used to provide additional information or additional context, but the native elements already have an accessibility API available. And a classic example is something like this, where you have a label element with an attribute in there, and it already has the for and ID, so the label is already being associated with the input, but the developer has added Aria label on top of that as well. And this can be things like Aria label, Aria describe by, Aria label by. There are a lot of ways that developers add extra information, but in many cases these aren't actually needed. I've also seen this a lot where developers add role equals button to button elements, and so they're adding an Aria attribute to something that already has native API. So these are things that a lot of it comes just from ignorance. Now, these sort of things can lead to problems in a variety of different ways, and in some cases you get doubling up of information. So you might get, in some cases, a form control being read out once with a label and then once with describe by or label by, etc. The second problem is this idea of being overly verbose. And this is where Aria attributes are added and along with hidden information, and they're used extensively across the application. And what this can mean is you get excessive amounts of information being presented to assistive technology users. And last year I worked on a banking application where that was the case. So every part of the application was excessively over the top described to screen reader users, and so it became burdensome for them to actually move through the application. And one of the pieces of feedback I got from a blind user was just that it was actually too hard to use because the developers had tried too hard to be good for assistive technologies. And the third problem is probably the worst case problem. That's this idea of copy pasting. And a lot of developers will just come along and they don't understand Aria, and they'll grab chunks of code from existing pattern libraries often, and then they'll just paste it onto pages inside their application, etc., without really understanding how the Aria attributes work. And this can lead to all sorts of problems. One problem I've seen quite often is where Aria labels point to non-existing ID attributes. And then, of course, the Aria doesn't work at all. So an example I've seen in the wild is where people copy things like a Bootstrap modal, and Bootstrap has Aria labeled and Aria described by pointing to the H1 or the H2s inside the modal itself, but there's an ID associated with that heading. Now, if developers come along and they take part of it, but they delete that ID, then the Aria describe by or Aria label by are pointing to things that just don't exist. So that is a real concern that we've got to be aware of. So the question then is, are there solutions to these problems? And this has been mentioned by quite a few people throughout these presentations, but the simplest thing is not to use Aria unless you really need to. And a quote that's been said a few times here is from Steve Faulkner, and that's the basic idea that if you can use native HTML elements or attributes rather than using Aria role states and properties, then you should do so. Another thing to be aware of is that wherever possible, all of us should be testing our applications, and we should be doing it with a variety of assistive technologies. In a few minutes you'll see that I'm going to show you some tests that I've run, and I run them across a range of browsers and a range of different screen readers. And in fact, Sarah mentioned this in her talk earlier on tonight as well. So this should include all major screen readers in different browsers, and the other thing is that we should be always testing in keyboard only. It's one of my favorite tests, is when I come to sit and test an application, is to unplug the mouse and just roll through the application, make sure that every component can be operated using keyboard only. Now, if possible, we want to work with a range of real assistive technology users and get their feedback as well, because that sort of thing is vital. And I think, again, this has been mentioned by other presenters, but you should try to make sure your audience selection includes different levels of skill. It's very easy to get hooked into the idea of working with highly skilled, for example, screen reader users, and then assume that all screen reader users work in the same way. But that's been proven to be completely false. And in fact, there are a whole range of screen readers out there, screen reader users out there, who struggle with even just basic tasks. And things like Aria information popping at them can sometimes actually be more confusing. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea of adding information for assistive technologies. So the problem here is that there may be times, and I'm going to be stressing this, should be used very sparingly, but there may be times when you want to provide additional information to a link or a button, and you want to provide additional context for screen reader users. And we might have a button or a link, in this case, saying purchase. Now this link may be acceptable for sighted users because they can see all around that link and get context for what's going on, and they don't require additional information. But for screen reader users, they may come to this link without any context associated. Now, it could be because the page is poorly designed and there's just no context around it, or it could be just because they're tabbing through and jumping on links. But you may want to provide, in certain circumstances, provide a little bit of additional context. And for those sort of people, we could provide something like, it should be announced with, purchase, the book name, and then the author or something like that. And again, it doesn't have to be used in all cases, but if you feel that it would add some context for these users, it can be used. And there may be times when you want to do the same with a button. Now, examples are, I've noticed that sometimes assistive technology users, when they try and close a modal, they're not really informed that they're in a modal or what's happening when they're closing it. And so the word close, while they know they're closing, they may not know what they're closing or what happens once they've closed. And so you may want to do something like close and return to account details or something like that. So how do we do it? Well, there's a range of different ways we can do it, and I'm going to show you a bunch of tests I did around about 12 months ago, so that the results may be slightly different with the very latest versions, but at least it'll give you an indication of, some of the solutions and the problems. So the first one is you could use an A element with the title. And this screen shows a series of tests that I've run for this, and it's in various columns. So we've got an NVDA, JAWS, and a voiceover column, and then down the side we have the various browsers that I've tested in. And you can see that this fails in WinIE11, WinIE8, and it also for NVDA, and it also fails in Chrome and Firefox for voiceover. So this one is not as robust as we'd like. The next method is to use Aria Label. And this one is much more robust. It fails in WinChrome NVDA. The third option you could use is Aria Label By, and with this thing you need to use the Aria Label By attribute, and then you need to put some additional information associated with that using an ID attribute. And this one fails, you could say catastrophically. It fails in a lot of different screen reader and browser combinations. Next up is Aria Describe By, and again we're associating that info1 with an ID. So what should happen is that it should read out purchase and then read the additional information. Now this one's much better, and in fact it only fails in Chrome in VoiceOver. And the last one is using a hidden span. So we're hiding something off screen and we're just putting the additional information in that hidden bit of information off screen. And this one, as you can see, passes all the tests for various browsers and screen readers. So this one is probably their most robust solution of all of them, even though some of the others are fancier, just by putting a tiny bit of information that's hidden off screen inside that link. It is the most robust solution. Now I've got a whole bunch of these tests you can see at the link there, and if you grab the slides then you can go and have a look at them at your leisure. Now the same thing for buttons. You may have to add a bit of information to the button, as we saw before, and for this case we could use the title, and similarly to the link, it fails. Now I've done different tests because they fail in different ways when it's a link or a button. So this fails in Win-i11, Win-i8 for NVDA, and it fails in VoiceOver in all three, Chrome, Firefox and Safari. Next up is Aria Label attached to the button, and that passes right through. So the Aria label here is quite a good solution, and what it does is actually drown out the content of the button itself. So that's a very robust solution. Next up we have Aria Label By, and as you can see, even worse than the link, this one fails really badly. And then we have Aria Describe By, and this one goes reasonably well. It fails in i11 and i8 for JAWS, and it fails in all the voiceovers, Chrome, Firefox and Safari. And then of course we've got our hidden version again. So inside the button we hide some content and push it off screen. And that, like our link one, is very robust and passes all tests. So the two most stable choices here are using Aria Label or the hidden content version. And again, more link information here. So a caution before we go on. Like anything, these should be used with care. As I said right earlier on, sometimes developers get too gung-ho and they add a lot of extra hidden information. These can be used really well in certain little touches, but shouldn't be, dripping throughout the whole application. And what you end up with is the application becomes too verbose. So now we're going to look at part 3, which is different info for assistive technologies. So part 2 is about adding information. This is about providing completely different information. So what is the problem? Well, there may be times when you want to provide different content for screen readers to the content displayed on screen for links and buttons. And I know a lot of assistive technology, a lot of accessibility experts will be going bright red with anger even at the thought of this, the idea that you might want to provide different content for different types of assistive technologies. But bear with me for a second. So here we have a link which says I can't even spell, AED, and then the dollar amount. Now this actually happens. I worked in a lot of banking, or a lot of complex banking applications where things like that are just assumed to be accessible for screen reader users. But what ends up happening is that can be read out as EID and makes no sense to the screen reader user at all. So what we might want to do is to give them some additional information instead of that AED. And what you might want to do is to provide something like United Arab Emirates and provide that information with the dollar value. So it's basically spelling it out. And we may want to do the same for buttons. Now I've seen this quite commonly done. I've seen developers who in a modal or something like that have a close button and they use an X symbol there. So this is a classic case where you want to change that. You don't want to provide the X at all. You want to replace it with something else. And you might want to say close and return to account details. So a solution for links. Basically, the best one we can use here is our swapping around 2 bits of information. So we have inside the A, we have 2 spans. And the first one is set to Aria Hidden True. So that means that it won't be read out by screen reader users. And it's set to AED as a value. So that'll be seen by everyone except for assistive technologies. The second one is for screen readers only, and this one is hidden off screen but will be read out. So for visual people, we'll get AED, but for screen readers, you get United Emirates Dirham. And that passes all tests that I conducted, of course. There may be things that I'm not aware of, and you can see more of the test cases here. And then let's talk about a solution for buttons. So what we want to do is swap out the information. And the Aria label is perfect here. So inside the button element, we can have Aria label and then put the relevant information. And as we talked about before, that X that's inside the button, the actual content value, will be overwritten by the Aria label information. So you won't hear the X at all. You will hear close and return to account details. And again, it passes all tests. And again, links to the test cases if you want them. So again, just like we mentioned before, a cautionary tale here. This should really be used with care. You don't want to get into this concept of swapping information for different technologies. This can be really beneficial in very certain circumstances, but shouldn't be used too often. And the reason is it can be potentially very confusing for assistive technologies, and it also raises the blood pressure of accessibility experts. And we don't want that because they're already stressed. Let's talk about part 4 now. We're going to go into dynamic content. So let's talk about the problem. So you have this super sexy notification that gets injected onto the page after the page loads. So something's happened and you inject a bit of a message at the top of the page and it says, well done, your changes have been saved. Now that's been added dynamically after the initial page has been loaded. So here's the problem. If you add additional content after the initial page is loaded, this can cause problems for screen reader users. And the first problem is that screen readers buffer the page as they're loaded, and any content that's added after this time may not be picked up by assistive technologies or screen readers. And the second problem is that screen readers can only focus on one part of the page at a time, and if something changes, then what could happen is the screen reader just won't pick it up. So it's something to be very careful of. Okay, so what are the solutions? Well, Aria Live is our great friend here. This attribute can allow us to notify screen readers when the content is updated on specific areas of the page. And we can apply it to any HTML element. And it's just done like this. Here's our div, and we've got aria-live is the attribute, and in this case the value we've got is polite. And I'll talk about the 3 options in a second. Now we can use JavaScript then to inject content inside that element, and screen readers will be made aware that the DOM has changed within that element. Now this can be used for all sorts of amazing things. It can be used for alerts and messages and warnings. It can be used, God help you, for things like stock reports if that's an important part of your site and you've got rolling stock information. It can be used for sortable tables. It's really good for letting screen reader know that the content of that table has been resorted. But the big question is, what are the possible values? And the 3 possible values we can use are off, polite, and assertive. The first one is Aria Live equals off. And assistive technologies, they should not announce updates unless the assistive technology is currently focused on that region. So a lot of people make this mistake that off means it won't register. It registers, but it just doesn't inform the screen reader unless they're sitting on that element or they pass back across that element. Now this is great for information that's not critical, things that they don't need to know immediately. The next one is Aria Live polite. And what happens is assistive technologies should announce this update at the next graceful opportunity, like at the end of a sentence or something. So if you're injecting that message we saw before, well done, your information has been saved, that should be announced if the screen reader user pauses at any point. Now this is good for things like second-tier notifications, warnings, things like that. Not critical ones, but information that should be notified to the users. And our last one is called Aria Live Assertive. And this one should be used for important and immediate updates. So this is for imperative information that the user needs to know right now, things like error messages. Now, unfortunately, Aria Live Assertive is not well supported at this point. So generally speaking, polite is a better solution. Now, there's a link to a bunch of testing I did some time ago, about 12 months ago. So again, it may have changed to some degree since then, but at the time of testing 12 months ago, the polite was a better option than assertive, sadly. Another thing I want to talk about briefly is this concept of Aria Relevant. So this attribute is similar to the Aria Live, but it gives a hint about what types of changes are relevant and should be announced by assistive technologies. So we could have something like Aria Relevant and then the value of additions. And that means it will only notify people of additional nodes that have been added into that live region. And the next one is Aria-Relevant removals. And obviously that's if you've deleted nodes inside that area. And the next one is called Aria Relevant text, and that will notify when any textual content has been changed. That could be deleted or added. And then the last one is called Aria Relevant All, and that will notify you when all of them have been changed, any sort of change in that area. Now the default is actually additions, or equivalent to additions text. Generally speaking, we should try and be aware of not using removals or all, generally speaking, because they can be overly verbose, and so we should try and use them sparingly. Next up, let's look at role equals alert. So role equals alert. Now this defines a message with important information. So we'd do it like this. We'd have a div or something like that, and role equals alert. Now elements with a role equals alert have an implicit Aria live value of assertive. So it's the same as writing Aria live dash assertive in terms of its notification. It does have, however, have different role in that it's telling people that this is an alert. Next up, let's talk about the error messages. So we're going to look at two different aspects of client-side form validation. The first one is individual form fields that are validated as the user moves out of the form control. So imagine you have an input box there for an email address. As the user tabs into it, it becomes active, and when they move out of it, in a lot of cases, validation happens at that time. And the second type of validation I'm going to talk about is this on-submit form validation. So when the user, what they think is finished the form, and they hit the submit button, and before that script's sent off to the server, JavaScript hijacks that submit and then checks the form and then tells the user, hopefully, that parts of the form are invalid. So they're the two different types of validation we're going to talk about. The actual form control validation on individual form controls and on the whole form. But problems. Form control error messages only appear after a control has lost focus, so when a user moves out of that area. And for this reason, it's not immediately presented to screen reader users. So screen readers often have to travel back through a form to notify, to find out that a field is invalid. The second problem is much more important, that screen reader users aren't informed about the overall form having errors, not just individual form fields, but the whole form. Now, I've actually seen this sort of case happen, and in a worst case, the focus remains on the submit button, even after the form has been found to be invalid, and the screen reader user has no idea why the form won't submit. Now, I was testing a site recently where it was a large university site, and I was using the keyboard only with the screen reader, and when I hit the submit button, deliberately left a lot of fields invalid. The focus stayed on that submit button and no notification happened at all. So the screen reader would literally have no understanding of what's gone wrong. So let's talk about a solution for the individual form controls first. When a form control is defined as invalid, the control and the associated label should be flagged so that users are made aware that there's an error. And it makes sense that the color shouldn't be associated with that. You shouldn't use color alone to signify errors. So I've seen people that use red alone to show that this field has been made as invalid. But for some people that can't differentiate between red and other colors, that can present problems. And the error message should be displayed in close proximity to that relevant form control. So we should have something like this. We have our label phone and input, and the message straight underneath would say error. The phone number must include a 10-digit number. Now all that's done in a very close proximity, so we know it's related to that field. The field is red, but the error message would work even if the user couldn't see that red color. Another thing that people forget is the error message should be informative. It should provide information that will help users fill in the field correctly. So a lot of people just use rote messages that are the same no matter what the user fills in. But ideally, if you can write it in an intelligent way, it should try and help them to fill in the form correctly, the form field correctly. Now the error message, this is the most important part. This error message should be programmatically associated with the form control. And there are all sorts of ways we can use to solve this. But what we're talking about here is it should be announced along with a relevant label. So the simplest way to solve this is to place the error message inside the content with the label. So this is a method I really like because it's very simple. We have a label with the for attribute, and then we have the label content. In this case, it's email. And then we have the input. Now you'll notice that the input is written after the label content, but it's all inside the label itself. Now the beauty of this is that when you get after the input, you'll see we have a span with an error message there. Now, as soon as the user tabs into that input, they will hear email and they'll hear the error message read along with it because it's all wrapped inside that label. Very simple solution. Now we're going to talk about solutions for on-submit form validation. Now, let's say there are one or more errors in a form. The first thing should happen is the error message should appear at the top of the form, alerting users that there are a bunch of errors. The second thing we need to know is we need to know that the focuses should be taken from the bottom of the form up into that error message area. The error message should list all the errors in the form so that users know what's wrong with the form. And ideally, each error message should be a link that takes users to that relevant form control. So this is like, I mean, it's ugly as hell, but this is a good example of an error message. It informs the user that there are a bunch of errors, and it lists the errors for them, and they can link straight off to those errors inside the form. Now you can use a hide show function, and if there's a lot of errors, some screen reader users I've spoken to prefer them all to be tucked away. They prefer just to jump over them, but they like the idea that they are there if they need them. Let's now talk about the markup for this error message. Now this error message can exist on the page even when it's not active. However, it shouldn't contain any content until it's triggered. So it should be set with role equals alert, and that can set the importance of it. So we have here a div with role equals alert. At this stage, there's nothing inside it though. And optionally, Aria Live can be added. You can add polite or assertive. Now, role equals alert should actually also have that, but you can add Aria polite if you want to have a backup. So we're going to put Aria Live polite here. Now we can set the container to tab index of -1 initially so that it doesn't receive focus at this point. Tab index -1. Now these are all, you don't have to do this. This is a suggested way forward. Now when the error message appears, we need to change a bunch of things dynamically in this. And the first thing we need to do is to change the tab index from -1 to 0. And now it'll appear in normal tab order. So you can see tab index is changed to 0. The container must be given a label. So, or it doesn't have to be, but it can be given a label so it's announced to screen readers. So we can set it with an Aria label and set it to form errors. So there's a quick indication of how you can make your form messages a lot more elegant and hopefully better for screen reader users. Now I want to talk about modals. This is a joyous part. I know a lot of people have bled tears of joy dealing with modals. So there are so many problems we're going to talk about here, and the first one is keyboard-only users. So a lot of keyboard-only users are able to tab outside the modal window while the modal is still active. And this, it says here, can be confusing and disconcerting. It can be downright frustrating. I've actually seen examples where a screen reader user has tabbed through the modal and then tabbed again and travelled then into the page behind, and then is able to tab right through the existing page. But when they try and act on something below, the modal is still above, so they can't action things on the page. So it can be very frustrating. The next thing is that screen reader users are sometimes not informed about what's going on. They're not informed that a modal is about to take place. It's about to pop up. They're not informed when it is popped up what's happening, and they're not informed when it closes. So problem number 3 is what I hinted at before, that often screen reader users aren't informed of the purpose of the modal when the modal is triggered. And problem number 4 is screen reader users sometimes sent back to the parent page, to the top of the parent page, after the modal window is closed. Now again, I've seen this and it's been very frustrating. About a year and a half ago, I sat in a bank working through their applications day after day in screen readers, and what was so frustrating would be you would pop up a modal, you'd work through the modal, when you hit close, focus would be sent back to the page, to the top of the page, and then you'd have to tab right back through the application to get to that little part you just worked on. Very frustrating experience. So some solutions. When a modal's not in use, we need to hide it so that it's not seen or not announced by screen reader users. And we can do that by setting that whole chunk of the modal to display none. And when the modal's triggered, we need to change the value. So with JavaScript, we can flip that and change it to display block. And when the modal window becomes active, we should hide all the rest of the content on the page from assistive technologies. And we can do that by setting it to Aria hidden equals true. So what we have is two big chunks. We've got all the main page and the modal. One is set to display none initially and then display block, and the other one is injected with Aria hidden true when the modal fires. Now we need to set the initial focus on the modal window itself rather than elements inside the modal, and this is a common problem I've seen in modals. So a lot of people will send the focus straight into a form control inside the modal, but the problem with that is that the user may not be aware of what they're being asked to do. So the first thing that happens is they click on a link, the modal fires up, focus jumps into the form, and it says something like email, and they have no idea what they're being asked, why they're being asked about it. So ideally we should set focus on the modal itself. Now this is important because it allows us to, we're going to give the modal a label, and the problem is that if we don't set focus on the modal itself, the label won't be announced to assistive technologies. So we need to inform screen reader users that this modal is a modal window, and we can use that with role equals dialog. And we need to provide a label for the modal thing. So what we can do is put Aria label by, and then we can hook that in with the H1. So when the modal fires up, they'll be informed that it's a modal window as a dialog, and then it will say choose account immediately because the Aria label is triggered by the focus being put onto that element. And we don't have to provide some other label, we're just hooking into the H1. So modal-label value matches the ID value. Now in some circumstances you may want to provide a more detailed description of the purpose of that modal. Not in all cases, but in some. And you could add something extra here. You could put Aria described by and then put a description there. And what will happen is when a modal is triggered, it'll inform that it's a modal dialog. It'll read out the modal label, so it'll say choose account, and then it will automatically start reading the description. So it says, you know, this modal or this component will do X, Y, and Z. Not necessary in all cases. I want to talk now about keystrokes because I'm really fascinated about how people deal with keyboard-only users, and can keep in mind that that's a much larger audience than just the screen reader users. So it's a really important audience to address. So a lot of the problems I've seen stem from people being able to tab outside the modal. You should only, once a modal is fired, you should only be able to tab inside the modal. So what you should be able to do is to cycle through this container, this modal container. So you see that the tabs will go, start at the top again. It'll start on the close button, which is a good place to start because then the user can bail quickly if they don't want to be involved in that modal. But you can see that it will cycle through and then go back to the top. The other thing they need to be able to do is a shift tab. So they need to be able to cycle backwards through the application, the modal. Now I'm bringing up a lot of the keystrokes here because I remember speaking to a developer team a while ago and was telling them that you should hijack the tab key and not allow users to tab outside the modal, which they did. They did that very well, and then they hijacked every other key. So all you could do was tab in there. You couldn't hit enter or shift or anything. So I've included these other slides here just for people be aware that there's a lot of other keystrokes that people need to do inside a modal, and the ones you want to hijack is a tab and shift tab, but not the other keystrokes like enter, because enter allows them to submit or close. And they also want to do, some people prefer to use the space key to submit and close a modal. And then we have tabbing and arrowing. So if you have a radio button inside your modal, once you hit that radio series of options, if you want to choose another radio option, you need to be able to use the arrow key to move down or up to different radio options. And similarly, if you're inside a select menu, you're going to need to use the arrow key to move through those various options. And finally, you need to be able to give users the escape key, and that's so that they can just hit escape and move outside the modal. Now, some of these keys aren't as big a problem. Like the biggest problem that I've seen that most people do is just allow people to use everything, so they can keystroke, use the tab keys, and move outside the modal. Let's talk about adding additional meaning to these actions here. So, as screen reader users are submitting data, they should be informed that they're being taken back to the parent page, that this information will be submitted when they return to the page, and ideally what we want to do is to give them rich information so they know what's happening. So an example, this may be a bit too verbose, but you might want to do something like submit and return to the bank balance information. Your data will be added to the balance table. Now that's a bit too verbose, but the thing that I've noticed is a lot of people assume that people understand what happens when a modal is fired. But for a lot of assistive technology users, they're incredibly confusing. They don't know that they're fired, and they also have no idea of this concept that they're working on top of another page and that their information goes back into the page below. The other thing we can do is to inform users what's going to happen when they close. So if you hit something like enter, providing a little bit of extra information may be beneficial in some circumstances. And you can say something like leave the form and return to the bank balance below, or something like that. Now after the modal closes, this is where we really want to get things right. When they're being taken back to the page, as I was saying before, the most important thing is not to send them back to the top of the page. The most common way people do it is to send them back to the element that then invoked the dialogue in the first place. So we really should be sending them back to a specific place, and we should inform them what's changed. And in an ideal way, if you hit enter or space, whatever, you should take focus either back to one of two places: the element that's triggered the modal, or in some cases I prefer, if there is new information being added to the page, the focus should go to that new information. Now there is a difference. I've actually seen examples where you fire a modal, you add bank balance or something like that, and when you hit close, excuse me, you're taken back down and it says add bank balance again. And I've seen screen reader users go, but I just added that. So I'll click it again, not knowing that their bank balance has been added just near that link, either before or after. Whereas if focus had been taken to the bank balance itself, and so the process is add bank balance, they go to a modal, they find their bank balance, then when it comes back to the page, it says your bank balance has been added and it's $1,234 or something. So the two places should be on the thing that triggered the modal or on the thing that's changed after they've used the modal, but definitely not back to the top of the page. That's just laziness. So to quickly wrap up, where to now? A lot of people have already mentioned this in their presentation, but when is the best time to focus on accessibility? Now, my passion, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, is pattern libraries. A lot of the work that I do is building pattern libraries from the ground up. That's taking tiny little Lego blocks like inputs and putting them together with labels, and then these things are put together into bigger components like login screens or user forms, and these are put together into screens. A lot of people may have heard things like atomic design, where they talk about atoms, molecules, etc. When you're building pattern libraries, you always start with the tiniest components and build upwards. Accessibility should be baked into these tiny Lego blocks, the tiniest elements. So if you have an input and a label, you should build the accessibility into that tiny component so that anytime it's used inside a login form or anything else, it already has its accessibility baked in right from the beginning. So I prefer to use accessibility right at the beginning of the process. And of course, proper testing as you go through. But if it's baked in right in those tiny little Lego bricks, then it's the best case scenario. And finally, some quick tips if you want to get stuck into this and you're worried about how to start. First thing is, don't be overwhelmed. Look for quick wins, and you'll be surprised how much you can do without too much effort. The first thing I love to do is to get stuck into keyboard-only testing. Unplug your mouse, start tapping away, and be prepared to shed tears, because in many applications, you just cannot use the keyboard. Here's the thing. If you can't use keyboard only, then it won't work for screen readers either. So if you can't even get a keyboard only to work, then you've failed even the first test and you need to make some changes. The other thing is to make sure designers, those evil bastards, don't turn off focus. And I've seen this in a number of applications where they have outline none. Now this is the work of Satan, because what it means is that a keyboard-only user literally has no idea where they are on the page. Second test is start using assistive tools. There's thousands of them out there, and I refuse to vote for one particularly over another. There's a whole bunch here that I'm sure other people have covered in much more detail. And the third thing is test in one or more screen reader users and make changes as needed. Nothing beats firing up a screen reader and listening to how it goes. For developers that have never seen it before, it's an eye-opening experience, and it really changes the way they see web applications or hear web applications. As I said before, it's not, it's a good start just to use VoiceOver if you can, or NVDA, which is free, or JAWS if you can. All of them are fantastic. But even that's not simple enough. If you're going to get serious, you have to start testing in a range of different browsers and screen reader combinations, and be prepared for tears. And then fourth, of course, there's many people out there that are much more experienced than I and have probably been sitting there taking notes throughout this presentation and are ready to get their lawyers onto me for a shocking advice that I've given. There are world-leading experts out there who have great information and can provide proper accessibility audits to your web applications. Get them involved. That's it. My name's Russ, and I'm done. So I think it's time for some questions. Our moderators, where are those sexy beasts?
Here we are, hopefully.
One of them's gone to sleep.
That was really great, Russ. Let me just check to see if we've got any questions on.
Here he is.
ID24 hashtag. I didn't see anything.
Yeah, I got.
If there's any been saying that they want to sue me, then just delete those tweets, please.
Okay.
So I've got some questions. Let's see. What is your biggest bugbear that you see mistakes that developers commonly make? What do you think? What's the thing that really annoys you, or you see most commonly?
Yeah, keyboard. I think I mentioned that in the talk. A lot of people, and throughout the presentations, it's really good that a lot of people are now focusing on screen readers. But to me, keyboard is it. If you can't use an application with a keyboard only, there's literally no point in even testing with anything else. I've actually sat with developers who are really, really smart, much smarter than me, but I've just unplugged the mouse and started tabbing around the screen and watched their faces drop in surprise and depression when they see that their application just cannot be used. And it's such a simple and eye-opening demonstration of how like beautiful applications can just fail even the most basic accessibility test. So that's always the first thing I do, and it's such a simple and brilliant test. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, is not only can you move right through the application with keyboard only, but more importantly, can you see where you're traveling as you move through the application? I've seen a lot of it, as I mentioned, where people turn off, and in some cases they don't do it deliberately, but there's little parts of it that you just no idea where the focus is. So it's really good not only to make sure that you can interact fully, but you can see where you are.
I totally agree, and I also agree with your point of just try it with a screen reader. You don't need to be an advanced screen reader user to benefit, I think. And if you're a Mac user, you have one built in. If you're on Windows, there's no reason not to do it. It's there's plenty of good guides to getting started with those as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I was testing at the bank, I began doing it on a daily basis, but when I first started, I'd been testing on and off with screen readers, but you forget all the commands. So there's some great resources out there with all the short key commands, and if you are going to get into it, I'd recommend, I think WebAIM has fantastic ones, but basically you can get a little cheat sheet, and I had it printed out beside me with all those simple key commands for NVDA, JAWS, and VoiceOver. And that really gets you started, because the first thing I've noticed when I began, and I've noticed a lot of other people do, I don't know whether you guys noticed this, at first it's a harrowing experience just getting the screen reader to work. I remember trying to get VoiceOver just to move across, you know, to read something on a page, and it was made me weep. So getting those short key commands and practicing a bit really helps.
Yeah, but definitely effort and time putting into it, I think. Graham, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, one thing I was going to ask is, we're moving now towards a kind of more mobile touchscreen environment as well. Is there anything that developers need to know in addition to what you were talking about today that these sort of technologies might pose problems for, and how they would deal with them in terms of the solutions you've provided, or do they need to do anything extra at all?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would just pass on that completely. I'm no expert in interactions on a mobile. However, there is a fantastic slide deck by this guy, a lot of you may know, I'm going to say his name wrong, Patrick Lauk? Help me out here, guys.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. Holy shit. Oh, did I say that? He has a fantastic thing on SlideShare, which is worth looking up, and I won't do it now, but I'll put it out on Twitter. A fantastic slide deck, which like 300 slides on rich interactions on mobile devices. So there are world experts out there. Don't listen to anything I say on it at all.
Patrick will be our next moderator for the session coming up at the top of the hour, so we can.
I'm sure anything you don't know his names, guys. That's appalling.
It's Patrick Lacker. Yeah, I think we can wrap up there. Thank you very much, Russ. That's great. That's obviously my phone going with all the positive messages to send on to you, Russ.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be involved.
It's great to have you. For everyone else, we will be starting up again at the top of the hour for our midday UK talk, so please join us then. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.